Hi everyone, my name is Naomi and I am a current student at Miracosta and am planning on transferring to UCLA for fall 2020, which is definitely exciting. But just like the topic we're going to be covering today, which has to do with ocean acidification and its role in coral bleaching. So I'd also like to draw the distinction between the polyps and the coral body. As we can see in the picture, the coral body tends to be the harder outer surface, and the polyps are what lie within that harder surface. So with that, we can kind of look at the bottom picture and see this difference as well, as the one on the left kind of shows the coral body, which is the shell, as we could reference it as, and to the right of that, we can see that softer body that would lie within the harder shell. Okay, so now that we have that understanding, we can move on to the coral anatomy. Corals are not just the colorful rocks we often idealize them to be, rather, they are living organisms, and they're essentially key to life as we know it, which we will be exploring more further in this presentation. But these corals are essentially colonial organisms, which is why we usually correlate corals with the greater reefs. So we're going to be analyzing the individual unit today. So with that, the tougher shells that we can often see on the corals closely simulate what would look like rocks, but they are actually the skeletons to the polyp that lies within it, as we did go over before. But the individual coral's body is called the polyp and is mostly stomach with a mouth on top. Its mouth is ringed with tentacles, but these aren't just tentacles. They are also lined with stinging cells, and some are actually filled with venom, for example, neurotoxins that paralyze their prey. And the polyps themselves have all of the structures that an organism needs. It has a mouth, tentacles, gonads, it can reproduce and grow, and basically all of the functions that a living animal would need in order to thrive within its ecosystem. But the role of these polyps consists of constantly secreting calcium carbonate to build these protective skeletons. And these coral skeletons are made of aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate. To grow up towards the sunlight, corals construct a framework. So now that we have that general understanding, I'd like to kind of go over the role of the polyps. Even though they do seem very simple, they are definitely more complex than the eye can merely see. So these coral polyps constantly secrete calcium carbonate to build the protective skeletons that encase them. And the coral skeletons are made of aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate, and they use this to grow up towards the sunlight, constructing a framework of aragonite crystals. And at the same time, they use this framework and kind of buttress these crystals with several clumps, and which thicken and strengthen the skeletons to help them withstand breakage caused by currents, waves, storms. And also, an interesting fact is that building this framework of crystals also helps them kind of prevent the further biting of worms, mollusks, and parrotfish, because the overeating of these smaller organisms can essentially um, ruin the framework of this coral and make them more susceptible to bleaching or disease as well. So with that, I would like to give a framework of where these corals can be typically found, and they can be found near continental margins, as we see in these aerial pictures in which they kind of tend to clump towards more closer to the land, which they have easier access to sun, and they need access to the sun because of how they undergo photosynthesis, and they depend on the byproducts of photosynthesis in order to thrive. So even though they do benefit more being closer to the continental margins, they can also thrive within deeper parts of the ocean where sun isn't as prevalent, although it is more difficult for them to be able to repopulate within those darker areas just because of the fact that they have limited access to the sun, and this can vary seasonally as well. With that, I'd like to kind of go next into the symbiotic relationship that these corals have with algae. And most reef-building corals contain photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae that live in their tissues, kind of as we highlighted before in that picture, which the zooxanthellae can be found within the tentacles. And the corals and algae have a mutualistic relationship in which the coral provides the algae with a protected environment and compounds they need for photosynthesis, essentially. So, in return, the algae produce oxygen and help the coral to remove wastes. Although, most importantly, zooxanthellae supply the coral with glucose, glycerol, and amino acids, which are the products of photosynthesis. And what's kind of interesting is how these corals tend to use these products to make proteins, fats, and carbohydrates and produce calcium carbonate, which, as we mentioned before, is an essential component to the building of these skeletons. And the relationship between the algae and coral polyp facilitates a tight recycling of nutrients in the nutrient poor tropical waters that they tend to find themselves within. And in fact, as much as 90% of the organic material photosynthetically produced by the algae is transferred to the host coral tissue. And this tends to be the driving force behind the growth and productivity of coral reefs. So, in that, we can kind of see the importance and the mutualistic relationship that often binds them together. And I'd also like to highlight how in the second picture, we can kind of see what the algae would look like on a zoomed in scale. And they do tend to be this small, as we mentioned before, they are found within the coral tissue. So they are very tiny plant cells. Now that we kind of know the tight-knit relationship that these corals tend to have with the algae, there are situations in which, in addition to providing corals with essential nutrients, the algae are responsible for the unique and beautiful colors of many stony corals. Sometimes when corals become physically stressed, the polyps expel their algal cells and the colony takes on a stark white appearance. This is commonly described as coral bleaching, and if the polyps go for too long without the zooxanthellae, coral bleaching can result in the coral's death. So although there can be times where a coral expels the algae while undergoing stress, but if another algal binds to it, the recuperation can essentially happen, meaning the coral would still have a slim chance of survival even after expelling their much needed counterparts, but the recuperation would have to be very quick in that the coral cannot go long without its algal counterpart. So in the first picture, we can kind of see that difference of on the left, that would tend to be a healthy coral that has its pigment and everything. And on the right, we can see that coral without its pigment. And we can thereby assume that the algal counterpart was expelled. And with that, I'd also like to go into the protection that the coral offers the algae. And the algae is thereby provided with a safe place to live within the coral tissue, and they also get to use the coral's waste products as nutrients to power photosynthesis. And the corals in turn receive energy in the form of sugars as products of the algae's photosynthesis, providing close to 90% of their energy, which is obviously a huge part. And if the algae was to be expelled, they would lose that 90% of the energy source they are used to receiving. So further, because of their intimate relationship with zooxanthellae, reef-building corals respond to the environment like plants. Because their algal cells need light for photosynthesis, reef corals require clear water. For this is the reason they are generally found only in waters with small amounts of suspended material, so also in waters of low turbidity and low productivity. This tends to lead to an interesting paradox in which coral reefs require clear, nutrient-poor water, but they are actually among the most productive and diverse marine environments, being why we should be so concerned in the protection and kind of conservation of these corals. Although going into more of a difficult and sad topic of corals is that, as is true for humans, stress can cause a strain on a relationship, and this is no different for corals and zooxanthellae, whose main source of stress in the past few decades has been rising ocean temperatures, as we are well aware. And this can result from human additions of carbon dioxide to the environment. So with that, I'd like to wrap up this slide, kind of leaving with the conclusion that the symbiotic relationship is not only important for the corals and the algae together, but it is also important for the ecosystem as a whole, as these corals do play an important part in the recycling and creation of nutrients for the marine ecosystem. we should be asking ourselves right now is, why should we study corals and ocean acidification? And why should we worry about the effects that it's having within the marine ecosystem? And I feel like this kind of resides within why are corals necessary? And with that, I'd like to just highlight some of the main things and the main roles that they play within the marine ecosystem. One of those being that they protect coastlines from the damaging effects of wave action and tropical storms. So, as we mentioned before, since they do populate more towards the continental margins, they do kind of act as this barrier towards um, the effects that wave action can have on land, and also on the closer parts of the marine ecosystem meeting up with land. And they also provide habitats and shelter for many marine organisms, and they're also the source of nitrogen and other essential nutrients for marine food chains. And with that, they also assist in carbon and nitrogen fixing, in which harmful chemicals from land runoff, fertilizer use, and fossil fuel emissions are turned into usable materials through the ocean's natural processes. And also, something very worth mentioning, I feel like, is the fact that they do help with nutrient recycling. So they not only take in nutrients, but they also create these nutrients that are very much needed to marine animals that are surrounding their ecosystem. The excess carbon dioxide emissions are becoming greater than the ocean can handle. So, with that, when carbon dioxide is released by humans, like for example through fossil fuel combustion, around 30 to 40% is absorbed by the oceans. So, a great part of it is diminished through the absorption of the ocean, and even then, what is excess and is not able to be absorbed by the ocean is what also plays other impacts on the world, such as global warming. So, if we think about what life would be without the ocean, we would have that 30 to 40% more of excess carbon dioxide emissions within the atmosphere, which would be just terrible to think about. Although, luckily, the ocean has its specific chemical mechanisms and processes in place in which the usual carbon dioxide emission is controlled and converted into a usable source of energy. But then again, if there is an excess of this and the ocean just can't turn it over fast enough, then this would result in more difficult things to handle for the ocean itself and for human life. Um, and then, but when these emissions exceed the turnover rate, the ocean goes from being alkaline at its normal conditions to becoming readily acidic, affecting a wide variety of organisms within the marine ecosystem. So with that, this often results in a lower pH. The ocean's pH tends to be about 8.2, but with increased emissions goes to about 8.1. Which often doesn't seem like much of a change, but when you convert this out of the log system in which the pH is calculated, it is about 30% of a change in the pH, which is far too great for the marine ecosystem to efficiently handle. So with that, ocean acidification is caused by rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, mostly from burning fossil fuels. And then this carbon dioxide is absorbed by seawater, which is H2O, and kind of setting in motion chemical reactions that produce more bicarbonate, which is the HCO3. Okay, this is the bicarbonate that we're going to be talking about, and fewer carbonate ions. So the carbonate ions are these, and these are the ions that are very necessary for coral reefs in being able to build their skeletons. To elaborate on that, I'd like to focus in on the study that is cited on the screen. And in the study, Mallorca and his colleagues dove on reefs and used a drill to extract tubular cores from coral skeletons in 4 locations of the Pacific Ocean, in which there was ranging levels of pH as well as carbonate ion concentrations. They then used a tomography scanner to image the skeletal cores, which reveal annual growth bands. From the scans, the analysis revealed that skeletons of corals in more acidic levels of water were significantly thinner. They then determined that declining pH and carbonate ions in seawater strongly affected the coral's ability to produce the aragonite bundles it uses to thicken their skeletons. Therefore, this model alone predicts that ocean acidification will drive up to 20.3 plus or minus 5.4% decline in the skeletal density of reef building corals. So with that, this kind of proves that ocean acidification is real in its effects noted in the corals and their bleaching. So on the next slide, I would like to kind of just share these resources that I found very helpful in being able to see what we can do on an individual basis to help the restoration and conservation of the corals and prevent the further bleaching. So thank you for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.